Misinformation and disinformation are nothing new. Misinformation, people sharing incorrect information by accident or without being necessarily informed, goes back to the earliest days of gossip, people sitting around fires tens of thousands of years ago. Disinformation is as old, at least, as politics and as war. And yet, it feels like something new is going on right now, something that's started in the early days of the internet, but has grown stronger and stronger as social media has taken hold and become such a vital part of our lives, in the sense that not only is it state actors and other large entities having the power to mislead and dissuade people and manipulate them in different ways, but with all of us having our own platforms online, whether we're doing it accidentally as misinformation or intentionally as disinformation, we are now part of what I would consider to be essentially a public health threat. That the amount of misinformation and disinformation spreading today in so many places undermines our beliefs in public institutions, in democracy, in vaccines, in science. And in some ways, it's been a losing battle for us. The people who want to share the disinformation, they seem to be winning in so many ways. But we shouldn't lose hope, because there are people and individuals out there who are coming up with new strategies and methodologies for tackling disinformation, fighting it at the source, working to make sure that our communities become digitally resilient to it, so they have the digital fluency skills, the critical thinking skills, the sense of civic duty required to combat disinformation, so the institutions that we've cherished so much in our society can be strengthened yet again. And today, I am fortunate to host 4 individuals who are fighting some of the most important digital fights today. First, I would like to introduce Hazel Baker. Hazel is Global Head of User-Generated Content News Gathering at Reuters. She directs a fast-moving team of journalists who are dedicated to sourcing, verifying, and clearing eyewitness media for timely distribution to agency clients. Prior to joining in 2017, she was digital editor and home news editor for Sky News, where she developed in-depth understanding of best practices in digital news gathering. Hazel.
Good morning, and thank you very much for that introduction. It's such a treat to be here at ONA. It's my first time, and I'm delighted to be here speaking to you all. I'm going to talk about an initiative that we carried out at Reuters, which seems especially relevant as we head into 2020 election campaigning, and it's to do with deepfakes. So I feel fairly confident in saying that most, if not all of you in this room will be familiar with Reuters News Agency. We play a big role in the global news ecosystem. Our text, pictures and videos are distributed to thousands of publications and channels around the world, from the biggest right down to some really quite small ones. This puts an incredible responsibility on us to get things right. We know that every single piece of information that we distribute will be rapidly republished and made available to audiences globally. And we also know that the clients that we serve have their own brand and integrity to protect. Our reports must be accurate and abide by the Reuters Trust Principles, which are independence, integrity, and freedom from bias. Now, the majority of our content is created by our 2,500 journalists worldwide, and that's not going to change. But from the standpoint of visuals, something has changed. As mobile network coverage increases, and so do networks themselves, it becomes ever more likely that the first cameras at the scene of news events will not be operated by news professionals. They might be belonging to governments, authorities, charities, activists, but in most cases, they just belong to the smartphone carried by witnesses. But this provokes a challenge for us. How do we know that this material is authentic? It can be very difficult to find the answers to that, and the material could be loaded with risk, particularly for our reputation and those of our clients. However, we know we have to persevere and we have to find those answers. Why? Because this material is a critical part of storytelling. If we disregard it, we disregard moments of history, we disregard scenes of proper human emotion, and we lose the opportunity to take lots of our audiences right to the heart of news events. Therefore, the need to verify user-generated content is present right around the clock, and we have a specialized team at Reuters dedicated to doing this. The team doesn't work in isolation, though. We've worked really hard to develop a collaborative verification workflow, which brings in the expertise and knowledge of our thousands of journalists worldwide, be that language, region, or community expertise. So when it comes to a strategy in the fight against misinformation, or in this case, manipulated visual content, I believe the most important aspect is familiarity. You simply have to know your enemy. And to that end, we collect and study examples. Every day we encounter visual misinformation, and we've got no shortage of examples to work with. From these examples, we can identify common threads, and we're also able to categorize them. We've developed a sliding scale that gives us a means to understand manipulated media in a comprehensive way. At one end of the scale is media that's actually not being manipulated at all, but it's taken out of context and used to feed a different narrative, sometimes devastating effect. You might remember a video earlier this year that purported to show Indian fighter jets launching strikes on Pakistan, but it was actually from a Pakistani air show a few years ago. Then we encounter video that's been edited, usually by quite simplistic means in off-the-shelf video packages. You will all know the Nancy Pelosi video that caused such a stir earlier this year, which many of us could have just have done on a laptop. Staged video is next on the scale. The media file itself is untouched, but the events it purports to show have been acted out by participants. They're not an authentic portrayal. CGI video is a level up on the scale. It does take some degree of expertise to authentically and convincingly modify video using CGI in a way that will trick large numbers of people, but it definitely can be done. And at the top of this scale fits the newest form of manipulated media that we're starting to encounter, and that's deepfakes, otherwise known as synthetic media. At the start of this year, it troubled me greatly that my team and I did not have any news-relevant deepfake examples to study. We could see the threat was looming, and we thought it would be sooner rather than later that we encountered one of these deepfake videos in our work. The only examples around were well-known academic experiments, or amusing rehashes of Hollywood blockbusters, or actually in some cases plucked from the depths of adult entertainment websites, the latter definitely not being suitable for frame-by-frame analysis in our meeting rooms. So we had an idea. Why don't we just make our own? The logic goes back to my first point. It's about understanding your enemy, in this case, manipulated media, with a view to developing a more effective strategy for defeat. In order to achieve those aims, I think we'd have ideally taken a topical news scenario, a real-life clip, and manipulated it in a way that might reflect a plausible real-life scenario. However, if the study of visual mis- and disinformation has taught me anything, it's that pictures and video can so quickly and easily become uncoupled from their context and used to feed an entirely different narrative. Therefore, if our deepfake video that we created was to end up on social media and shared, although it were real, I knew it could not mislead or harm anyone, and that was an absolute guiding principle. So in the end, we had to use our own colleagues as actors and formulated an entirely hypothetical scenario. In this case, it was a down-the-line business interview. Take a look at the summary video of this experiment that we produced. Please, can we roll the video?
Nous avons ouvert notre deuxième site de production au début de l'année. Et aujourd'hui, je suis heureuse de vous annoncer que nous allons investir 1,2 milliard d'euros supplémentaires.
As you know, we opened our second production site earlier this year.
Je suis heureuse de vous annoncer que nous allons investir 1,2 milliard d'euros supplémentaires. Cela va nous permettre d'augmenter de plus d'un tiers les capacités de production de notre site de la vallée de Cocoma.
So what did we learn from this? Well, personally, I learned a lot about how to actually create a deepfake, and that's important to me. I learned about what kind of material you need to begin to create one, and I also learned about some of the limitations and factors that play a part in this. We were able to test our verification processes by sending this video without explanation to members of the UGC team and to other video colleagues in our department. The aim was not to trick them, but to get them thinking. What were they looking at, and were there any clues? We were able to identify several red flags, notably the audio-visual sync issues and some inconsistencies with the mouth shape, particularly over sibilant sounds. And actually, most importantly, we found that those people in our newsroom who were a little bit aware of the topic of deepfakes were much more able to identify these red flags quickly than those who were entirely new to the topic. Finally, this gave us a very effective piece of training material. It was interesting to people far beyond the visuals department at Reuters, and it served as a really important conversation starter. This was a conversation that we really had to have before we start to see deepfakes become more and more common. As we began to roll out this video, I had this great idea that we were going to somehow inoculate our colleagues and make them immune to deepfakes, and that clearly was wide of the mark. The technology in this area is progressing so fast. The process of creating these videos and also the outcome is changing so rapidly that one video can simply not have that effect. We've got to keep studying deepfakes, and that's what we're doing. We're identifying all the ones that come into the news ecosystem, unpicking them, understanding their motivation, and looking at how they were created. We're also really closely watching developments in deepfake detection. I know there are several companies working on solutions for this, but we're also aware that these technological solutions are unlikely to be definitive. They're not going to replace the human intelligence-driven verification processes. Our video didn't quite test out that process because it was presented without context or source, and that's definitely not reflective of a real-life scenario in which the source and the means of transmission are highly relevant. However, I think the discussion and the consideration generated by this newsroom experiment is what made it just so valuable to us, and why I think it was an effective strategy in the fight against visual disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you, Hazel. I'd like to invite Michael Hayden to join us now. Michael Edison Hayden is Senior Investigative Reporter at the Southern Poverty Law Center, where he focuses on internet radicalization and far-right extremism. He recently wrote a guide on open source intelligence reporting for Columbia University's Tao Center earlier this year. Michael.
How you doing? So I worked for a lot of different news organizations before I worked for Southern Poverty Law Center. And if there was one thing I could tell myself then that I've learned since I started, it would be this piece of information, which I think could be useful to you, as we face the 2020 election. So SPLC sees its biggest rise in hate group recruitment in 2001, 2002. Does anybody know what happens in those years? Anyone? Yeah, I thought it was 9/11 too, actually. It is not. What happens is, for the first time, we have newspaper reports about census data that shows that whites are going to become a minority in the United States at some point in the 21st century. You may hear that and say, okay, so what, right? Like, we're all going to be minorities at that point. It's not like a big deal. But what it becomes is the central recruitment point for hate groups for the next 20 years and will continue to be. And I believe it's going to be remembered as one of the most important, if not the most important, bits of disinformation of the 21st century. Brenton Tarrant, who allegedly murdered 51 Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand, called his manifesto the Great Replacement. And Tarrant begins his manifesto with a refrain. He writes, "It's the birth rates, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates." And what Tarrant and legions of people who agree with him believe, even if they don't agree with his violent actions, is that these demographic changes, which many of us and rightfully see as a natural part of social evolution, are being forced upon them through either by, in the case of the alt-right, Jews. In the case of more mainstream pundits like Tucker Carlson, cosmopolitan elites. In the case of somebody who works in the White House, Stephen Miller, cosmopolitan elites. In the case of someone who has bad press on a particular day, it's journalists who are doing it. But beyond terror attacks in Pittsburgh on October 27, 2018, Christchurch, Poway, California in April, and most recently El Paso, beyond men carrying torches in Charlottesville, chanting, "Jews will not replace us," beyond the President of the United States retweeting an account that was called White Genocide TM as a candidate in January 2016. Trump's done so many things, we forget about that one. Beyond that, beyond the fact that we have a State Department official who is currently on leave and under investigation, who talked about building a white ethno-state and arming it with nuclear weapons, which Southern Poverty Law Center reported in August. Beyond that, this myth, this idea of forced demographic replacement undergirds so much of the disinformation that props up Trump, that props up Brexit, and so much of the reactionary disinformation that we are experiencing every day online. So I'm being very brief here. I'll just give you a quick anecdote. I once spoke to a very high-profile white nationalist who had written several things about me that were demonstrably false. And I asked him, like, why do you do that? Why do you do that? I mean, it's so obviously a lie. And this person told me, right, you know the answer to that. What is it? He asked me. And I knew the answer to it. He's doing it because he feels it's the best method for him to protect the white race against demographic replacement. So for reporters who do not work at Southern Poverty Law Center, the most simple thing I can tell you is you should be aware that this is happening. You should be aware that more people believe it than you think. You should be aware that when you see someone who never logs off and who is constantly posting lies and hate online, that underneath that is this fear of demographic replacement. And almost anything that comes out of that reactionary space that is a lie and that is disinformation is undergirded by that essential myth. And that's all I wanted to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael. Next, we have Shalini Joshi. Shalini is a specialist in verification at Proto, the International Center for Journalists partner in India for TruthBuzz and other media development projects. Shalini set up and managed the tip line used to collect WhatsApp-based rumors for Checkpoint, a research project to study misinformation phenomenon at scale during the Indian election. She's also the founder of Khabar Lahariya, a rural news network in India. Shalini?
Thank you, Andy, and hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about the Indian context because I feel the context of India is quite different from the United States and also other regions. But I also think that there are many strategies that have been tried out in India and in other places to combat misinformation that have the potential to be tried and tested in other election regions as well. So I'm going to start by telling you a story, and I have a photograph here from the Indian election. So now this photograph was being shared just 2 days before the results of the general elections were to be announced in India. The headline of this report says that trucks loaded with electronic voting machines have been caught across the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. Now, this photo was being shared very widely on Facebook, on Twitter, and on WhatsApp. The Election Commission of India even put out a clarification saying that all allegations of tampering of voting machines were baseless. However, these photographs were posted multiple times in multiple formats, and within hours, this story went viral. So why were these rumors being shared on social media around the elections, and especially around the time that the results were being declared? Now, these photographs were from India, but these could have been from any other region where elections were being held or where results were going to be declared. Already there are concerns being raised about the vulnerability of voting machines that will be introduced in the 2020 US elections. So voting machines and rumors related to voting machines are quite common in election cycles, but there are also other rumors and other suspicious messages that tend to go viral during the election period. So in India, during the general election that just concluded in May this year, there were other rumors that also were being shared on Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, and other platforms. There were also a couple of new techniques that were deployed by people who were spreading misinformation. And what were some of these techniques? I'll talk about a few. What we saw were really lengthy text messages that were really difficult to debunk. So you can't debunk part of a very long text message and not address the remaining part. There was more visual content, more photographs, more memes, more screenshots that were often falsely credited to mainstream media organizations. There were also more opinions and some facts, which makes it very difficult to address a piece of misinformation using open source verification tools. And in addition to all this, in the Indian general election, we saw the use of closed messaging apps. The 2019 election in India was popularly called the WhatsApp election because of the way WhatsApp was used in spreading misinformation in the election. So why is there so much misinformation, and what are some of the factors that are promoting this kind of misinformation? You may be aware that in India, in the last 2 years, about 32 people have been killed because of online misinformation, and many others have been injured. So if you look at the context of India, a huge challenge is posed by the sheer number of people who are accessing unverified online information. There are about 485 million people in India that have access to smartphones. Out of the 485 million people, there are 400 million, about 400 million active WhatsApp users in the country. There are also other closed messaging apps that are extremely popular, especially in rural areas. And increasingly, closed messaging apps are becoming platforms where a lot of rumors, false information, and misinformation is being shared. You may also be aware that unlike Facebook and Twitter, some of the closed messaging apps, like WhatsApp particularly, uses end-to-end encryption to keep conversations private, which also means that it becomes very difficult for newsrooms and fact-checkers to figure out what's going on in that platform. What is trending, where a story is originating, when it's going viral. It's quite difficult, and there are no analytics that are offered by WhatsApp to give newsrooms an idea of all this. So in this context, where there is misinformation, where there are so many users accessing these platforms, what can be some of the strategies to address and respond to misinformation? We need to make fact checks more relevant for a lot of people, for local communities, for underserved communities, for first-generation internet users that include young people as well as older people. And some of the effective strategies that people have tried in different places include using local languages that are spoken by large communities across different parts of the country, and putting out content in that language. Also, engaging with people on the platforms that they are using. It's very important to do that, and I'll give you some examples of that. And also involving local people as listening posts, involving citizens in the process of addressing misinformation. I have some examples from ICFJ's TruthBuzz program. In Nigeria, one of the ICFJ fellows was involved in creating fact-checked videos in Pidgin English, which is the most common language in the country. And the videos that she created were extremely popular among people who spoke Pidgin English. Another ICFJ fellow in Indonesia is using Instagram to communicate with young audiences. Now, every day she receives misinformation tips from followers on Instagram. She forwards these tips to the local fact-checking agency in Indonesia that she works with. And the verified information from the fact-checking agency is shared back on the same Instagram account with the followers. Her followers have increased tremendously in the last couple of months from the time that she started this. Then in terms of newsrooms and newsrooms engaging with fact-checking, I think in the last couple of years, a lot of newsrooms have addressed issues of trust and credibility, and it is promising to see that newsrooms across the world are taking steps to address misinformation and also increase audience trust. ICFJ's forthcoming survey on the state of technology in global newsrooms, and the survey has been funded by Google and Fusion, shows that 1/3 of news organizations have dedicated fact-checkers on staff, and 44% newsrooms have engaged in more fact-checking activities over the last year. Finally, I'd like to talk about a project or projects that look at misinformation at scale, especially on close messaging apps. How do we understand the patterns of misinformation across issues, regions, languages, on platforms like WhatsApp? And one way of doing this is to crowdsource and study misinformation on these platforms, to build coalitions in order to run projects of this nature. I led a project called Checkpoint that was implemented by Proto, ICFJ's partner in India. Checkpoint was designed around the Indian general election, and it was designed to study misinformation on WhatsApp by creating a database of rumors and false information. So how did this work? To crowdsource misinformation, we launched a tip line on WhatsApp where citizens could send rumors or what they thought were suspicious messages for verification. To encourage people to send rumors and messages that they thought were suspicious, the Checkpoint Verification Center would verify at least 8 of these messages and send them back on the same tip line to the users. In the 7 phases of the Indian election, the Checkpoint tip line received over 150,000 messages, out of which 82,000 were unique messages. This data set is now being analyzed to understand the patterns of misinformation at scale. Now, Checkpoint was a project that was commissioned by WhatsApp, and the technology for the project was developed by Midan. The project framework was designed by Dig Deeper Media. So what was different about Checkpoint and what was unique about it? And are there lessons from this project that can be taken to other election areas and to places like the United States or Canada and other countries? One of the insights from Checkpoint is that this project was able to access, monitor, analyze, and debunk misinformation on a closed messaging app like WhatsApp. So if you think that WhatsApp is not a problem for this area, for the United States, then I think we need to think again, because there is misinformation on other platforms. There's Facebook Messenger, there's Instagram, there's Snapchat. How do we address misinformation at scale on these platforms? Are there some learnings from Checkpoint that can be taken here? The other thing is that Checkpoint was also able to build a collaborative process where technologists, specialists, researchers were able to come together to develop, design, and implement a project. Can there be similar collaborations in other places as well, where a lot of people from different sectors can come together and citizens can come together to address this massive misinformation storm that has hit us? Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. Last we have Tai Nalom. Tai is co-founder and director of Brazil's award-winning fact-checking site Aos Fatos. She has a BA degree in journalism from the State University of Rio de Janeiro and covered national politics in Brazil's most influential newspaper, Folha de São Paulo, in Brasilia, Rio, and São Paulo for almost 6 years. She's a finalist in the 2019 Online Journalism Awards this year, General Excellence in the Micro Newsroom category. Tai.
Hi, that's me. Good morning to you all. I'm gonna be fast, I guess. Aos Fatos carries at its core a technology-driven team and a creative approach to fight misinformation in Brazil. For 4 years, we covered the presidential impeachment, the Olympics, the World Cup, the downward spiral of a political crisis that ended up in a hatred and misinformation-charged election cycle last year. It is a difficult task, the one that we have in Brazil, but it's not different from anywhere else, actually. Brazil is a continental country, just like the US, just like India, for instance, and with extra difficulties regarding literacy, access to fast internet connections, and of course, verified information. Either way, Brazil's population are social media heavy users. They use it for to talk to friends, to their families, to read the news, to engage with political activities as well. Everything in just one smartphone, for instance. Brazil is the second largest country in WhatsApp use in the world. If I'm not mistaken, it is the fourth on Facebook. And between 2018 and 2019, this landscape is evolving. So social media growth was particularly strong among Instagram users, WhatsApp users, and YouTube users. These are probably the 3 main social media platforms that will be envisioning and developing actions to tackle misinformation in Brazil for the next couple of years. Brazilians, they go to social media to read the news. For news, they use Facebook. 54% of a survey run by Reuters Institute said that they read the news through Facebook. And 53% of the answers said that they read the news through WhatsApp. And 42% through YouTube. So here we got everyone reads the news through social media, and sometimes those apps in their smartphones, they are not actually developed for that. Since mid-2016, smartphones not only overtook computers as the primary means of accessing online news in Brazil, but it's a major part of our routines. Meanwhile, overall trust in news dipped 11 percentage points to 48% in comparison with 2018, directly affected by an atmosphere of political polarization. So 87% of Brazilians say that they primarily get their news from the internet, even though they don't trust it. And To add in the top of all of this, Brazilians have the highest level of concern about misinformation and disinformation in the Reuters survey. And high use of social media facilitated the spread of inaccurate information during our election season last year. So the scenery basically is we have low levels of media literacy, plus zero rating policies towards Facebook and WhatsApp, which means that people are more engaged in these apps because they are not charged by using it. And that's why fact-checking partnerships are difficult with these platforms, because people basically are only using WhatsApp and Facebook. Most Brazilians, they feel that the internet is just WhatsApp and Facebook because they don't have the money or the data plans to go fact-check for themselves outside those apps. So the challenge is where to develop our content. Is it inside our website where people can't click the link and go to there because data plans in Brazil, they are expensive and the connection is slow? So we have to figure out how to reach people that don't have access to fast connections. And we have to pack content inside these platforms in most compelling formats. We are trying to get the news, to make people get informed while they are talking to their friends and talking to their families that have specific values and that have different opinions about many things. And it is who they trust. They don't trust the news, they don't trust journalism, they don't trust fact checkers, but they trust their friends and parents. So for WhatsApp, the solution, there's none, but we are trying to develop some. Pictures and plain text. We know for a fact that the most engaging content that people share on WhatsApp are memes and pictures and texts. Why is that? Because in small velocity connections, it is more engaging to share that. For polarization, writing down explainers. Oswatos is a very well-developed fact-checking operation, so we have stamps that say if something is false or true. But this is somehow people miss the point sometimes when they are reading this, our text. So sometimes an explanation is less polarizing for some discussions. So that's that. For going viral, because we are talking about social media and we are talking about people engaging with images and memes, we have created cartoons, basically for explaining to people what's going on and what are the main topics of discussion in Brazil right now. For misinformed, listing sources and explaining methods of investigation. That's perhaps we as journalists, we know how to get the information, and we think that only being didactic about what's going on in politics or public policy or everything else is enough, but it's not. People don't have any clue of what we do and what are these sources you're talking about. We have to explain that to them, and we have to explain the method we had to get to there. And for influencers spreading false content, because this is a reality here in the US and in Brazil and perhaps in most places. Twitter alerts done by a bot. We created a bot that answers to people when they share misinformation. So we try to tackle and to access people that otherwise wouldn't have access to our content by advising them not to share that. excellence in journalism, tackling misinformation, is also prioritizing the simple and the effective. Some solutions are pretty obvious, they are in front of us, and we are probably missing the point thinking about really sophisticated methods. But I think that we have to go back to basics. And that's it. Thank you.
Hi. So, just for administrative purposes, there are a number of mic runners in the room. I've got plenty of questions. We could talk for hours on our own, but that would seem unfair to all of you. So I'm going to kick it off with some questions. But meanwhile, if you do have a question, and I emphasize the word question rather than a statement, please, raise your hand and try to track down one of the mic runners, and we'll go back and forth and make sure that some of your questions are addressed. But I'd like to kick things off with just an observation from something at least two of you spoke about, Shalini and Michael, but also I think it certainly applies in Brazil as well, what seems to be a vicious cycle that exists between misinformation and disinformation doing this awful, awful dance with racism and hate speech, xenophobia, anti-LGBT messaging, and the like, creating a scenario where disinformation breeds violence, which breeds more disinformation and more violence. How on earth do we tackle that? Do we have to come up with strategies, not only in our reporting, but in our society to be addressing hate and hate groups and hate speech on the one hand and disinformation on the other? Or can we start in one area and disrupt it that way? How do you even begin tackling something this large? Sure, if you want. For me, I think the most important thing is to, in the case of at least the United States and Western countries, is to simplify your thinking and try to understand the motivations behind the stuff you're seeing, rather than get into the micro details of one particular post about Antifa coming to, what was it most recent? It's like Antifa is calling child protective services to take Trump children away or something like that. That was like a story that was yesterday, a piece of disinfo that was out there. Rather than get into those micro details, to just step back and to understand what is undergirding all of it. And as I mentioned, it is almost exclusively this belief in that demographic replacement is happening and is being done to people, to erase them, to eliminate them. It's a basic fear. It's like, when people have nightmares about losing their teeth, it is essentially that. And when you simplify it a little bit, I think it becomes easier to handle those individual stories. And Shalini, is that the case in India as well, given the communal violence that we've seen in recent years due to social media and messaging services?
Well, I think that misinformation thrives in areas where there are social differences, where there is polarization, and then technology is used to amplify that. So I do feel that when we talk about designing media literacy initiatives, or when we talk about fact-checking initiatives, they also need to look at the offline context while designing online content. And only when we are able to understand and address the offline context where there is hatred or polarization or social differences that exist, can we design media literacy initiatives that are more effective. Otherwise, I don't think we can do one and not address the other.
So does that mean that fact-checking in some ways is too limited of a solution? I mean, obviously, we need to be fact-checking, and there need to be more groups and more people doing it, but at the same time, it sometimes feels like we're just rearranging the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, because it's day in, day out, a defensive mechanism about whatever happens to be circulating that day. I mean, as fact-checking organizations, is there more we can be doing to create a sense of what the bigger picture is and how the public can get involved in addressing it, or for major news organizations like Reuters. Is there a public-facing version of that training that should be out there so people become better understanding of deepfakes and other emerging technologies? Are we getting too caught up in the fact-checking aspects?
Should I go first? I think it's important to understand, from our perspective, what's causing that sharing of content. You talked about the birth rate issue. We've talked about the polarization and the poverty issue. And actually, an example where we see a lot of misinformation shared is natural disasters. And I think it's fear is driving a lot of that. That's what the common thread is there. And if we can work out what it is that the audiences are scared about and what's causing them to share, and can we fill that void with quality information, that's kind of where I think our role is, because you can spend a lot of time doing debunks, writing about fact-checking, doing individual claims, but actually, if you do that, the bandwidth's limited in the newsroom. Are you taking away from resource to report on something else? If you can work out what it is, what information the audiences need, and make sure you give it to them, and it's as thorough as it could possibly be, I think that's probably where I certainly feel our responsibility is. I don't know about your organizations.
I think that, right?
You're on.
Yeah. I think that we expect a lot from fact-checking. Sure. And it's basically, it would be the solution to correcting politicians, to tackling misinformation at scale, to fighting bad actors on social media, I listed 3, but there are plenty of demands that people think that fact-checking has to address to. And perhaps that's not the case. For instance, bad actors, hate speech on social media, are these journalistic topics? We are there, of course, to cover these kinds of patterns and behaviors, and I feel that the future of fact-checking is actually trying to discover who is behind those bad behaviors. But it is a legal problem, and is an institutional problem in a level of the environment of the tech industries and any other actors, advertising, politicians. So it's a way more broad problem that fact-checking and small organizations, because it's being led a lot by small organizations around the world, can't manage. So.
Well,
yeah.
It's interesting that you bring up some of these other industries, because one thing we've been seeing in our work lately at DFR Lab, monitoring disinformation campaigns, is how many of them are latching on to ideologies, but for commercial purposes. They're essentially trying to whip up conversations online and be part of trending disinformation online as a way to sell products or to serve the interests of a politician who may have hired them to get more attention their way. So yeah, we've got a situation that is much bigger than journalism right now. So what do we do to work with other entities outside of our industry in a way that we can get things done, but also make us feel comfortable? Because it means working with platforms, it means working with policymakers, it means working with local groups that might not always trust journalists. Again, how do we begin to even coordinate all of that?
It's a challenge. If we had answers to that, I feel that we wouldn't be here right now, right?
Yeah.
But I feel that when we say that we have to educate people and create media literacy programs, we are thinking like from 10 years to now. We have to act now. So perhaps the most challenging thing I feel is to get tech giants together and make them act together against hate speech, misinformation, and everything. Because we know for a fact, in Brazil at least, that Facebook and Twitter, they started to tackle misinformation, but other platforms didn't, such as WhatsApp. So misinformation, it was on Facebook and it was transferred to WhatsApp, which was a free place with no other kinds of regulation. So they have to act together to create an environment. And they have to rely on the specialists, basically. It's
Shelley,
difficult.
you wanted to jump in, and then we'll take a question over there.
This, that I think it's really important to build coalitions and coalitions across different sectors, because misinformation is here to stay, and it won't be possible for fact checkers or newsrooms working on their own to address it. But if there are groups that come together, I had one example from India actually, where in the northeastern state of Assam, the police launched a campaign, a social media campaign on Twitter and Facebook, where they talked about fact checking and the kind of digital storytelling that they used humor, they used pop culture, and they reached out to a lot of young people. And within a month's time, from the time that they launched the campaign, the sleepy Twitter handle and Facebook page of Assam Police had huge followers, like the numbers went up to millions. So I think it's like the law enforcement machinery, along with citizens, along with fact checkers, working on something, and these collaborations and coalitions and partnerships are important.
So we have a question up here.
My name is David Kaufman. I'm with News Corp in New York. And you kind of answered my question a second ago, but it seems as if from what you're talking about, particularly in the Brazilian and the Indian context, that users of platforms like WhatsApp and Instagram, they're now leading or they're major players in disinformation, even beyond the actual developers. So the users are actually innovating even faster than, say, the Googles or the developers of the world. And first I was going to ask, do you feel that the big tech companies are actually taking this threat seriously, and are they actually actively doing something to prevent it? Although the nice Brazilian person, I forgot your name, you said that yes, it seems that they are. But my other question is, do you guys feel that there's a role for government in this? Does the government need to step in and regulate or create bodies that will work to combat this sort of disinformation innovation? Is there a role for government in this? And if so, what is it?
Should I go?
Anyone who wants to jump in first?
Okay. I think that it's a bit difficult to decide what the role of governments should be. Of course, governments should be promoting media literacy initiatives in various institutions, in educational institutions, in other places as well. But in India, and I'm sure in other places also, there has been a debate over whether government should regulate social media platforms, and whether by doing that, it's also going to in some way impinge on the right to freedom of speech and expression, and any kind of regulation may then be not desirable. So there is that debate in India at the moment that's going on, and what role should government play in that? I personally think that government should be promoting media literacy initiatives at various levels, and that's a role that they should proactively play.
Yeah, I'm not sure about government regulation. I'm not sure I trust my own government to regulate social media properly. But what I would like to see is them setting a good example and not using any of the, well, certainly synthetic media that we're seeing evolving in their own campaigning. I think that definitely would be a good starting point. But as for regulation as a whole, I've got lots of reservations about that.
So we have another question over here.
Hi, my name's Steve Morris. I'm from the UK. Work for a technology company called Bubbler, and we've got some solutions to these veracity issues, but that's not the point I'm making. The question I'd like to ask, I think everybody in this room is to some extent missing the point, I think, is why are these people, these right-wing reactionaries, so angry? And my perception, particularly on the observations of the Brexit debate in the UK, is it's because most of the people, most of these reactionaries feel abandoned. And they feel abandoned because the established news industry doesn't report on the problems these people have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So in the UK, we have massive issues with housing, we have massive issues with homelessness, we have massive issues now with food banks everywhere, we have issues of rickets cropping up in schools again, appalling, and none of the mainstream media report on it. So we're partly responsible for this. These people feel abandoned. And that's why they're so angry and so dependent. They feel like the establishment, whether it be the governments or whether it be the news industry, doesn't report on their real problems. And I think we have to be. My view is, I don't know about yours, but we're neglecting them. We're part of this problem. We're causing it.
So what do you think? How much of we are part of the problem, and how can we be part of the solution? I mean, this is obviously something that the existential moment that newsrooms had after Trump's election, wondering how did we miss the story? Well, it's because we weren't covering huge swaths of the U.S. and the populations there and the challenges the people face. And of course, every country has different populations feeling like they're being left behind. But at the same time, I feel like, at least in the U.S., news organizations have stepped up in a big way, trying to cover things more broadly, and yet I don't see disinformation getting much better here. So how do we reconcile that?
Well, it's difficult.
Yeah.
In Brazil, we are facing basically the same issues you mentioned, plus an active and engaging propaganda from the government saying that they are the ones fighting the system, right? So they are in power, but they are fighting the system. It's something that doesn't make sense, but it makes sense for their supporters.
Which goes to the earlier question of what role government has when, in many places, governments are the bad actors, or one of the bad actors.
Yeah, so it's difficult even to take measures against misinformation, because what is the government and who are the actors that will build these kinds of policies? It's difficult. But for instance, in Brazil, we have, putting aside politics and going to real life issues, misinformation on health is something that grows, it is always viral in Brazil. It's a problem regarding vaccines, for instance. And however, when we fact check something about it, when we debunk any kind of memes or misleading texts or anything about it, it has a lower engagement. So people, even though people are facing these real life problems, it's not as engaging as being engaged in politics and having an opinion about what's going on today and yesterday.
See, we have a question down there at the end.
Hi, my name is Chris, and I'm with Politico. My question is, I understand we're making significant strides in countering deep fakes and disinformation campaigns after it's been distributed. But what about in live time? For instance, on the White House lawn or on Twitter, what are some practical steps that you suggest for journalists to take to counter disinformation as it's being distributed in live time in press conferences? I guess one example is I know a Reuters White House reporter, if the president is saying something that's sort of misleading in a response, he would correct him in live time. And I guess, do you have any practical suggestions for countering disinformation in live time?
I would say be clear about the source of where the information is coming from, and be honest about what you know and what you don't know, and promise a follow-up, and make sure you deliver on points that you think are sufficiently important to make sure we get a resolution to. But obviously, going back to, I think, Charlene's point, a lot of it is a fact or a non-fact mixed up with a piece of opinion. So extracting that does take time. It's not often easy to do it right on the spot. That said, some of the statements that people make, which are not opinionated, should be able to be fact-checked in real time, and that's where we need to work with technology partners and use AI to develop those kind of strategies.
So we're almost out of time. We have time for just one more question, and so I just wanted to go down in one direction or another. What's on the top of your wish list? I mean, if you had something right now, whether it's a technology or a policy or a type of partnership that you think would actually move the needle in some way, what would be at the top of that wish list?
Shall I go first?
Yeah, might as well.
I saw a suggestion, this is entirely not my idea, about having a pause button on sharing for social media. I think if you had that on the whole time, it would be utterly infuriating. But I think there are certain occasions, heightened political moments just before elections, or in times of natural disaster, where that would be really useful. And it could just come up with a pop-up to remind you that what you're sharing might not be what you think it is, and have you considered, and here's what you can do to think about that. So that would be my wish list.
For me, and for Southern Poverty Law Center, we have been calling for social media companies to change the terms of service. The bottom line is that they are making money. They are off of exploiting people's fears. And they have been, and they will continue to do it, no matter how many promises they make. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Facebook and Instagram are the same thing, right? But all these companies will continue to turn a profit. They do not have your best interests in mind. And what I would like to see is them get serious about removing people who are weaponizing the platform to create dangerous situations.
I think for me, it's collaborations and coalitions. That's something that I also talked about across different sectors that are important, and addressing misinformation at scale. And I think that's possible only when people from different sectors and citizens come together to address something as big as this.
I think that better because, well, as I said, the platforms, they lack transparency on who are the bad actors and who is publishing hate speech and misinformation, what are the patterns, what it takes to be expelled or have a content removed or anything like that. We don't know. Osfatos is a fact checker with Facebook, so disclosure. And it's difficult for us to get to know even what we are fact checking inside there. What is the impact of our work? Is it effective? It is, this kind of resource is decisive for us to think about strategies to tackle misinformation. So basic data about these actors.
Well, like I said, we could talk about this all day. I apologies to all of you who didn't get a chance to ask a question, but we're here for the conference, so please, by all means, feel free to chat with us between sessions. In fact, we have an extended break right now, so please join me in thanking the panelists for their time this morning. And enjoy the rest of ONA.